afternoon, everybody, and I thank you all for being here and sharing your valuable time on for being with us today and sharing a few words with all of us. I thank Shield for giving me this opportunity to be on the Foxy PCO month and share a few words about PCO and the GDM nexus. As we are all aware that PCO and GDM have a definite connection between each other. They are so well intertwined between each other. So the whole talk of this webinar is that if we know that there is a connection between the two, can we utilize this connection or this nexus to our benefit and to the benefit of the next generation to prevent diabetes mellitus, because as we all know that India is slowly becoming the diabetes capital of the world. It is a tsunami in the happening, and gestational diabetes or hyperglycemia in pregnancy is the best screening method for picking up these type 2 diabetes mellitus. Hence, if we could decrease the incidence of gestational diabetes mellitus, maybe we can decrease the incidence of type 2 diabetes mellitus in the near future. And that is going to be a real boon for at least our country and the world in total. GDM is an epidemic unfolding in India, as we all are aware. And unlike the current aggressive pandemic of COVID, GDM is a silent killer. The problem is serious because pre-diabetes and diabetes affects approximately 6 million births in India, of which 90% are due to GDM. That is, only 10% would be the ones which have been detected even before have been detected before the pregnancy. There is a very high prevalence because India alone, GDM affects 5 million women each year. And unfortunately, only half of the GDM patients get tested postpartum and are followed up postpartum for diabetes mellitus, although most of us know that GDM women are at a high risk of type 2 diabetes mellitus. So what is more confusing is that there are a lot of people are not aware, a lot of physicians are not aware of the correct screening techniques, when to screen, how to screen, and often to screen. Gestational diabetes mellitus or hyperglycemia in pregnancy is defined as carbohydrate intolerance of variable intensity or severity with onset or first recognition during pregnancy. The prevalence of GDM ranges from 1 to 20% globally. And if you can see the statistics in India, it is at a high of 14% in India, of which in the urban areas, it is 17.8%, which is very high. It's a humongous percentage. The rural population also accounts for 9.9%. The risk factors we all know are the non-white race, especially the Hispanics, the people of Spanish origin, Asians, then the age over 35 years, obesity, a family history of diabetes, a family history of GDM. If the woman's mother was GDM during pregnancy, and the woman, when she was pregnant, when she was in utero, the mother had GDM. Then a history of bad obstetric history, especially IUDs, stillbirths, and macrosomias. History of prior GDM in the previous pregnancy and polycystic ovaries. Here we've gone through all the histories, but most important, women diagnosed with polycystic ovaries have a 2.4-fold increased chance of increased odds ratio of getting GDM, and this is independent of age, ethnicity, and multiple gestation. We all know what is polycystic ovaries. Polycystic ovaries affects 5 to 20% of the women of the reproductive age group. It is a heterogeneous condition, and the symptoms can vary from, say, reproductive symptoms, that is anovulation, oligomenorrhea, endocrine dysfunctions, the psychological symptoms, especially because of hirsute or acne, and most important are the metabolic disease or the metabolic syndromes, which are turning out to be more and more important. A complex disorder with an impact on quality of life, so it requires a timely diagnosis, screening for complications, and management strategies. PCO, we know the root cause is insulin resistance. So the diagnosis of PCO, I think nobody here needs to be told about the diagnosis of PCO. According to the Rotterdam classification, we have got oligo or anovulation, clinical or biochemical signs of hyperandrogenism, and the appearance of polycystic ovaries on ultrasound, which shows more than 12 follicles and with a thickened or an echogenic stroma. Indian women have a very high prevalence, which is 41% in the reproductive age group, of which urban is more than the rural, probably because of a lifestyle. The epidemiological link, which this is where I would like to stress, we all know that polycystic ovaries cause an increased risk of gestational diabetes mellitus. Then polycystic ovaries increases the risk of type 2 diabetes mellitus about 4 times. 60% of gestational diabetes mellitus patients develop type 2 diabetes mellitus, and insulin resistance, that is the root cause of PCO also, is present in about 65 to 80% of the women with PCOS. So we all know that GDM, polycystic ovaries, and type 2 diabetes mellitus are inheritable and interchangeable because of various twin and genetic studies which have demonstrated familial clustering for PCO and type 2 diabetes mellitus. Girls born to women with PCO are at an increased risk of PCO in adulthood. Daughters and sisters of women with PCO have higher levels of adrenal and ovarian androgens from adolescence to adulthood, and a family history of type 2 diabetes mellitus is a known risk factor for gestational diabetes mellitus. Hence, these three etiologies, that is PCO, GDM, and type 2 diabetes mellitus, are all interconnected. We know that genes load the gun, but finally, it is the lifestyle which pulls the trigger. So, even with a loaded gun, if we do not pull the trigger, if the lifestyle can be manipulated, if the lifestyle can be controlled, and then a loaded gun may have the potential to be dangerous, but is not dangerous. What are the complications which can be minimized or avoided if we can control, prevent GDM from occurring? The maternal complications are preeclampsia, polyhydramnios. Then we have the perinatal mortality and the morbidities, the fetal complications like macrosomia, hypoglycemia, hypocalcemia, hyperbilirubinemia, which we all know are the immediate complications of the neonate, and a long-term complications of type 2 diabetes mellitus and a recurrence of gestational diabetes mellitus. These things can be controlled, can be minimized if we can prevent GDM. And this is where I feel that if we know that there is a nexus between PCO and type 2 gestation and gestational diabetes mellitus, then if we can control PCO, then maybe we can do something to prevent GDM from occurring. We know that early onset of GDM patients fare poorly compared to late onset of GDM. That is, if a GDM is detected in the first trimester, in the first time when she comes to you and you screen her for GDM and she turns out to have hyperglycemia, and if it is uncorrected, then they fare poorly because they have a higher rate of perinatal and neonatal mortality and morbidity, as well as preterm complications. You can see this chart on this side, and you can see that if we detect GDM early, then the complications are definitely less, as you can see on the orange line. The blue line, that is if we are detecting hyperglycemia late. That means somehow we have not done the first trimester screening, or the woman has come to us late and we have detected her GDM late. That means she has had hyperglycemia for quite a long time prevalent in her bloodstream, and then the complications are definitely going to be higher. Although if it is not controlled, then the complications are going to be much more. But an early detection, so an early detection of gestational diabetes mellitus is very important to prevent the complications or minimize the complications. We know that as high as 80% of GDMs have an impaired glucose challenge test right at the first trimester. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is what I would like to stress on, that screening at the second trimester may miss out early GDM patients. The best way to test GDM or to screen GDM is at the first antenatal visit and not at 28 weeks or 30 weeks, because we have learned that the DIPSI guidelines is 28. DIPSI guideline has not said 28. DIPSI guideline has said screen at the first visit, and if she is hypo and if she is normo or euglycemic at the first visit, then do a repeat test at the 28 week. But the first visit screening for GDM is mandatory. Then this is something which I would like to share, that is a fetal programming in GDM. Now, an adverse environment in utero or an adverse environmental insults during pregnancy causes diseases later in life, that is the Barker's hypothesis. So we have two scenarios. One is where the woman has, there is a lot more sugar in the bloodstream, that is, it is an overfed state that of gestational diabetes mellitus. Now, when there is a lot of sugar in the bloodstream, the baby is getting a lot more sugar. So, because of the lot more sugar, the fetal pancreas is secreting higher than normal insulin. Therefore, an overfed maternal state programs the fetal pancreas for insulin overproduction. What happens as a sequelae to this is that there is an early exhaustion of the beta cells. This beta cells, because of the early exhaustion, later when there is an increased demand of insulin, or when there is a need for insulin, the beta cells, because they are exhausted, they may not be able to secrete the adequate amount of insulin, which leads to type 2 diabetes mellitus in an adult life. So a continuous hyperglycemia prevalent during the in utero state can cause a beta pancreatic cell damage or exhaustion in the fetus, and that is where it causes type 2 diabetes mellitus later in life. Now let's look at the other scenario where it is an underfed state. So either it is maternal starvation due to vomiting, excessive vomiting, or maybe you have been very strict with the glucose control and kept her on in a hypoglycemic state. Now you will be comfortable saying that, oh, there is less sugar, so the fetal pancreas does not need to produce insulin, hence a lot of reserve is going to be there. But unfortunately, that does not occur. The fetal pancreas definitely produces less insulin, but funnily, because of this, the fetal pancreas gets habituated to the less insulin. A kind of plasticity develops in the fetal pancreas, and the fetal pancreas production capacity gets compromised. So when the later in life, when there is a need for more insulin secretion by the pancreas, the pancreas cannot reciprocate and the fetus grows up with a limited capacity to produce insulin, which leads to type 2 diabetes mellitus. So, see this chart, and which is quite, I think it's quite evident and self-explanatory, which says both underfeeding, that is both hypoglycemia as well as hyperglycemia, can cause a disease state. And it's only a normal diet, it's only a euglycemic state. If we can maintain that euglycemic state in pregnancy, only then we can produce a healthy fetus who grows up to be a healthy adult. So this is very important, that an in utero environment cannot be adverse for the fetus. So finally, what we all have realized is that gestational diabetes mellitus is basically a type 2 diabetes mellitus, which is triggered by pregnancy. So because it is a glucose impairment which appears or recognized for the first time in pregnancy, it is closely related with type 2 diabetes mellitus and has got a lot of and insulin resistance is common to both GDM and type 2 diabetes mellitus. So any woman where the stress of pregnancy can produce diabetes mellitus can produce type 2 diabetes mellitus later in life. So what can we do about these? Before that, let us see that why don't all pregnant women become gestational diabetes? We all know that there are placental hormones which cause insulin resistance. But as soon as the placental hormone is removed, the insulin resistance should go away. That means there should be a normal insulin resistance. In normal pregnancies, the pancreas has enough functional reserve to counter the insulin resistance. But what happens in GDM is that the pancreatic reserves are lower, and hence they develop gestational diabetes mellitus. Now, which is something which is very important is that as the pregnancies keep increasing in order, that is, with the second and the third pregnancies, the pancreatic reserves become worse and worse. And hence, if she had a slighter chance of getting type 2 diabetes of GDM in the first pregnancy, by the second and the third, she is definitely going to be GDM unless corrected, and finally end up with a type 2 diabetes mellitus. Insulin resistance, we know, is defined as the failure of the target organs to respond normally to the action of insulin. So what happens in this is that more insulin is produced so that the glucose uptake can be there. And yet this is a condition in which the muscles, the fat, the liver, the adipose tissue, they display resistance to insulin and utilization of glucose for energy and metabolism. Now, what are the factors which cause insulin resistance? And this is something which is very important, because this is something which we can change. First aspect, if you can see the first circle, is genetics and aging. Nobody can change that. Nobody can change us growing old, and nobody can change our genetic pattern as of now. Although there are studies being going on with genomics, which are saying that they are finding out the women who have got a high chance of GDM, and in their fetal cells, they're trying to isolate that gene and remove that gene so that that baby will not develop diabetes later in life. But yes, those studies are still going on. So at the present scenario, let us say that genetics and aging cannot be changed. So what are the acquired ones? One is a central or a abdominal obesity. Second is a sedentary lifestyle, a high fat diet, and certain medications like beta blockers, thiazide diuretics, even steroids, corticosteroids. All these lead to an increased insulin resistance. And this is where we can attack. This is where we can take care of by lifestyle modifications. And even there are certain nutrients which have been found to decrease the insulin resistance, like chromium. Then next is berberine. So a lot of companies are coming out with berberine drugs containing berberine, which they say is going to decrease insulin resistance. Then even magnesium. they say is decreases the insulin, high insulin resistance can be brought down. Actually, they increase the insulin sensitivity. So maybe if we can do some lifestyle modification and then add some micronutrients, we may be able to make a dent in this rising prevalence of GDM. How is insulin resistance measured? This is definitely, nowadays we know it is by HOMA, that is a fasting blood sugar with fasting insulin divided by 2.25. And this is something which is coming up more and more. And this is where we are scared of diabetes. We are scared of GDM. Why? Because we know that all babies born to mothers with GDM and all mothers with GDM may end up in something called a metabolic syndrome. And a metabolic syndrome has got a very, very, very bad prognosis so far as the cardiovascular diseases are concerned. So what is this metabolic syndrome? It comprises of mainly four factors, which are like glucose intolerance or diabetes, dyslipidemia, hypertension, and obesity. So this deadly quartet or an insulin resistance syndrome or in syndrome X is something which is supposed to be the end result of a type of GDM or a baby born to a GDM mother. And that is why, this is the reason why we are so concerned about GDM, and we are doing more and more webinars and more awareness about GDM. Why is Foxy so focused on GDM? Because we have realized that if we can pick them up here, if we can screen and pick them up here, we can definitely decrease the incidence of metabolic syndrome, which is going to be a big thing later in life. And we are going to have a major population of our country which is going to be sick. So there is an urgent need to curb this epidemic. I'm sure all of you realize that definitely there is an urgent need. How can we do it? First is by education of our medical fraternity. Our medical fraternity should know when to screen and how to screen gestational diabetes mellitus. And even now, when I hear people saying that random blood sugar and fasting blood sugar, no, it has to be after 2 hours after 75 grams of glucose. Next is a patient education and awareness. Women and their families should realize that PCOS are at a high risk of GDM. So the moment you get a girl or an adolescent girl with PCO, you have to tell her that tomorrow she is going to have complications, not only getting pregnant, because their only concern is ki bacha ho sakta hai na, is she going to conceive? But tell her that even if she conceives, she has a high chance of GDM, and the baby itself may have a high chance of type 2 diabetes mellitus. So this kind of patient education is very, 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 very important. Next, we should definitely do universal first trimester screening using a single step 75 grams glucose. And this should be a routine part of anti-taste testing of every antenatal woman. When I say universal, it is definitely all antenatal women. Prevention steps should be utilized not only if you detect GDM, but also women with known PCOS, known family history, the women who are coming to you in the preconceptional period. Preventive steps should be used. And then once you have anyway detected GDM, early management is mandatory, because when you do early management, you can decrease the complications. So what is the management? We all here know the management. There's nothing to speak about in detail. So I'm just going through a quick revise. Once you detect that her PP after 2 hours of 75 grams glucose is more than 140, we start off with medical nutritional therapy and exercise. So diet and exercise. After that, we repeat a 2 hours postprandial blood sugar, and that value should be less than 120. Now you will ask why PP and why not fasting? It has been found that when you do PP blood sugar, that is got a better it prognosticates better for a fetal outcome rather than a fasting blood sugar. So if you can do a 2 hours PP and you find out it is less than 120, you continue MNT and physical exercises. But more than 120, you have to start her on oral or injectable hypoglycemic agents, that is either OHAs or insulin therapy. And then you keep monitoring her blood sugar, postprandial blood sugar. On insulin, you also need to monitor her fasting blood sugar. So what are the management principles? We all know there are 4 main management principles. One is a self-monitoring of blood sugar. She can do it herself. That is the best thing if she has a glucometer. So especially if she's on insulin, that is, so she needs to do it one fasting and definitely after all the meals. Then you have to target the glycemic goal. That is something which is very important. Whether she's on oral hypoglycemics or on injectable or on diet therapy or even on the newer drug regimes like myonistal. And the fasting blood sugar has to be less than 90 and the 2 hours PP has to be less than 120. The management options are diet, metformin, insulin, and we have some newer options like inositol. So the newer options, as we have already said, the newer principles are inositol. Then we have something called gene therapy. And as I already mentioned, some micronutrients may be effective, not in managing of GDM, but in prevention of GDM. Again, the genomic therapy does not manage GDM. It is only the thing for prevention of GDM. And I've already mentioned that if you can do an early control of the hyperglycemic status, then the complications are going to be much less. The current treatment paradigms are as follows. Metformin. This is one of my favorites. I really love using metformin. Then next is insulin and inositols. Metformin, we know it attacks insulin resistance. There's a wide experience of using metformin, and the best part of metformin is it does not cause hypoglycemia. There is a slide which says it does not prevent GDM, but if women who conceive with PCO and you continue the metformin throughout pregnancy, then there may be a chance that she does not develop GDM in that pregnancy. So metformin, if used throughout pregnancy in a woman at a high risk of GDM, especially PCOs who conceive on metformin, metformin may prevent GDM in those conditions, but if not continued throughout pregnancy, it does not prevent GDM. Next is metformin is definitely not tolerated by all because it causes a lot of gastritis and flatulence. It cannot manage severe cases for which insulin is required, and it definitely does cross the placental barrier as well as it can be secreted in the breast milk. So there is a fetal risk is also query. There is some kind of a fetal risk which they say can exist. Then and then again in the breastfeeding, they say metformin is controversial because it may cause hypoglycemia in the neonate. But I still love metformin. Insulin is definitely very efficacious. The only problem is it's injectable and it can cause hypoglycemia. So one has to be very strict about monitoring the blood sugar in this. It cannot prevent all the complications of GDM, especially if not controlled properly. And definitely it does not tackle the root cause of insulin resistance. Here what we are doing is that because there is insulin resistance and the need for insulin is more, we are giving more insulin. Now, inositols, I have less experience using inositols in pregnancy. I'll be very frank about it. But they say it both prevents and manages GDM. It attacks the root cause of GDM because we all know that it is basically insulin resistance and deficiency of inositol. So if we are actually replacing inositol, maybe we are attacking the root cause of GDM. It leads to a favorable fetal and maternal prognosis, and it is definitely safer than insulin and metformin. However, there is a limited usage experience, limited investment in the by the pharma industry in research, and then it takes time to show results. Like I'm starting insulin today, I'll get a euglycemic stage. I'm starting metformin and I can monitor the euglycemic stage. But if I start inositols today, by tomorrow or day after tomorrow, I may not get a euglycemic stage. So it takes much longer to monitor that euglycemic stage, and there is a confusion exists in terms of dosage and formulation. So unless some protocol is made about that and further studies are made about that, inositol is still in the offing. Although it is still being used, it is being used nowadays during pregnancy. In summary, I think I've spoken a lot. GDM is a rising epidemic in India with serious complications to both mother and child. And this is something which all of us are aware about. GDM complications are directly linked to the maternal blood sugar level and the period of exposure to hypoglycemia. That is very important. OGTT with 75 grams of glucose, or GCT, I would correct it as GCT with 75 grams of glucose is mandatory for all women during the first ANC visit. And if she is found to be euglycemic, then it is repeated again at 28 weeks. Insulin resistance is always present. It may not be the root cause of a GDM because there are other causes also. They're saying inositol deficiency and various other causes. Now, metformin is a very good drug, oral hypoglycemic, to manage GDM, but they say it may not prevent GDM in a high-risk case because otherwise you'll have to continue GDM throughout. And inositol is showing promise in both treating as well as preventing GDM. Thank you. I'll end here because my experience with inositols is pretty less, and I would like Prachi, I think you can take over from here. Thank you all for giving me a very patient hearing.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much for that excellent data. And yes, you had given special focus on screening. So yes, this is absolutely necessary. We do have a Myonos presentation on myoinositol in PCOS. There is an international speaker, Dr. Fabio Faccinetti. He is from Italy, from the Child and Infant Department of the Modena University. And we have his recording, and he is discussing about the myoinositol data in PCOS. So we would be having that recording now. It will take another 15 minutes or so. And after that, we will have a Q&A session. So when the doctors have questions to you, I will read out to those questions and you can answer their queries now. So thank you very much. Chitra, can you play that recording, please?
And I move on my next lecture, which is about inositol for the treatment of PCOS. Could I have my slides? Meanwhile, we have reached more than 600 participants, and I'm very happy of this. Let's say we will discuss in my presentation something about the clinical use and the clinical relevance of inositol treatments. Now you have understand why I put a turtle in my presentation, because the inositol molecule in the space has been parallel to that of a turtle. So we move on. Could I move myself, or it's not? Okay, thank you. The story, in brief, in 5 minutes, I would like to resume all the story of about we understand about PCOS. And we start very far, you say, from 1921, when Archard and Thierse described a diabetes in a bearded women. And this some interesting observation parallelize metabolism problem and hirsutism. But we have to go through to Stein and Leventhal, we have to go through Stein and Leventhal because through pathological findings, they make another correlation. They make a correlation between a menstrual cycle disorder like amenorrhea, which was associated with some peculiar presentation of bilateral polycystic ovary. You could see here their glasses when they demonstrate the presence of the polycystic ovary. At that time, we are still on 1935. And we make a big jump and we go on. And we go on 2003, when at the beginning of this millennium, after many disputes about the etiopathogenesis of PCOS, and since such disputes does not arrive to a final point, in Rotterdam, a lot of researchers and scientists decide to be more pragmatic and to describe PCOS as their clinical signs and symptoms appear, so including oligoanovulation on one hand, clinical and or biochemistry hyperandrogenism and the polycystic ovary itself. So when 2 out of these 3 criteria are met, we could classify a woman on a PCO syndrome. And this at least allows to the fact that on our scientific papers, we speak all around the world the same languages. And later on, there was just a small but significant increase from my point of view, because when we try to describe the different, there are 4 phenotypes of PCOS, where anovulation, hyperandrogenism, and PCO are mixed, each one with the other in different phenotypes. For the first time, the international organization acknowledged the issue of metabolic risk, because as it is important for me and for all the women in the world that suffer of PCOS, is that we have to face a women that in fact share many symptoms and many biochemistry of so-called metabolic syndrome. As you could see from the slide, the prevalence in the general population is 6.1% of metabolic syndrome. And if they look at PCOS with whatever diagnostic criteria is used, the situation, the prevalence of metabolic syndrome in those subpopulation is around 10. Therefore, we could ascertain that PCOS subjects carry a 2-fold increased risk of metabolic syndrome. But it is not only this. We have also to acknowledge that they displayed a 5-fold increased risk to develop type 2 diabetes lifelong, which means that when we have in our clinic a woman with a PCOS, we have to bear in mind also this complication of her life later on. And this introduced the fact that one of the few agreement that have found among many different researchers and scientists around the world is that the insulin resistance is the mainstream of the PCO condition. Insulin resistance allow hyperinsulinemia, and hyperinsulinemia through different mechanisms, the lowering of sex hormone binding globulin, the increasing of ovarian androgens production, the disordering of LH, FSH release from the pituitary, allow for the symptoms that you are normally seeing in these women, which are hyperandrogenism on one hand and anovulation on the other. Insulin resistance is easy defined. In order, look at the panel in the bottom, in order to reach a normal utilization of glucose, so in order to maintaining glucose level in a homeostatic situation, we need much more release of insulin than in normal condition. And this means that these women, these patients, are prone to later on develop and stress all the metabolic system, and then to undergo to a chronic situation like the metabolic syndrome and diabetes mellitus type 2. And just to have an idea what's about insulin sensitivity is in normal women and in women with PCOS, this data from UNAIF reported us that if we have a normal lean patient and respect to this one, a normal lean obese patient has a lower insulin sensitivity, which is nearby and parallel those of an PCOS women, lean PCOS. If in addition to a PCOS we have also obesity, the insulin sensitivity is further decreased and is absolutely superimposable to the one reported in people suffering of type 2 diabetes. That's why we told about inositol tonight and their effects in PCOS. Myo-inositol is an insulin-sensitive agent, and the increase in insulin signal is obtained directly activating the GLUT4 in the cells, or also through de novo lipogenesis and a reduced fat, so the activation of free fatty acid. The main results is an increase in insulin sensitivity, as it was demonstrated in a series of elegant experiments by Soulages in France. Mariano reported this slide, and we are speaking about these two compounds, which are very, very similar one each other, you could see from their formula. And these two compounds are the most significant one and are the most interesting one as far as PCO is concerned. It is important to remember that once myo-inositol is activated by the epimerase enzymes, is transformed into dichiro-inositols. But this conversion is unidirectional, is not bidirectional, and depends on insulin. So the highest are the insulin level, the highest will be the conversion from myo-inositol to dichiro-inositol. And dichiro-inositol and myo-inositol act as second messengers in the cells. The main message that they drive is those of insulin, but it is interesting also to know that inositol also is involved in the message of FSH and in a lesser measure of TSH. Just to understand how biochemist is related to function, this is the panel or the experiments made by Larner, and you could appreciate that the presence, the significant presence of dichiro-inositol in the tissue is just on those tissue in yellow where there is a glycogen store. So in the fat, in the liver, and in the muscle, where is the accumulation of energy, the storage of energy, dichiro-inositol is significantly present, let's say in a ratio 3 to 7, 4 to 7. In all the remnant tissue, in the blood, in the kidney, in the intestine, in the spleen, and so on, there are almost negligible amount of dichiro-inositol present, while the main part of inositol is represented by the myo-inositol. And the same occur also in the follicular fluid. In fact, measuring in the general circulation of healthy young volunteers, women and men, you could see, women in follicular phase, of course, you could appreciate here that in different studies we ever reported a stable evaluation of the two concentration, the relative concentration of myo-inositol and the ones of dichiro-inositol, and they are around 40 to 1. That's why in many publications we consider this the so-called physiological role of myo to dichiro-inositol in our body. And it seems that something is wrong in the PCOS. So it seems that myo-inositol and dichiro-inositol play a pathogenetic role in the context of PCOS women. And so let's go into the clinical evidence. We performed with Vittorio Unfer and the co-worker, and also assisted by John Nestler, which is the first one who discovered the activity of inositols in women with insulin resistance. And we performed a meta-analysis and a systematic review of the inositol effects reported in clinical trials. We recognized at that time, so it's 2 years ago, 9 clinical trials with 250 people, 250 women in each arm of the trial. The primary outcome of our meta-analysis was the effect on fasting insulin values, and we have also other secondary outcomes, which are HOMA index, the insulin resistance index, test androgens levels, as well as sex hormone binding globulin levels. So look briefly at this meta-analysis. You could see here easily how our primary outcome was demonstrated in this meta-analysis. The treatment with inositol arrive to produce a significant decrease in insulin levels, in fasting insulin levels. And let's say consequently, perhaps, but in any case, as an independent evaluation, also the HOMA index is reduced. And this is the most important demonstration of inositol as sensitive insulin agents because they reduce insulin resistance. The effect on plasma androgens, testosterone and androstenedione are not significant. You could see the diamond, the green diamond, which cross the line of 1 in both panel, while an interesting evaluation was done on sex hormone binding globulin. We divided the trials in two different ways according to the length of treatment. And if you see that if you administer inositol for just 12 weeks, you do not change anything, which is the first diamonds in the top. While if you proceed with the treatment and you enlarge the treatment for 24 weeks, then you obtain an increase of sex hormone binding globulin, which means a reduction in free androgens, in free testosterone, namely, and therefore a reduction in hyperandrogenemia also from a clinical point of view. Not only this, another researcher did an evaluation, a meta-analysis on the lipid profile during inositol's treatment, and you see from top to the bottom that total cholesterol, triglycerides, and LDL cholesterol are all significantly decreased by the administration of inositols, while no impact was obtained on HDL cholesterol. And this means that not only endocrine situation changes, but also the lipid profile changes. And all these effects are in the same way as being very helpful for the metabolic syndrome treatment. Of course, we have obesity, and obesity is an additional further complication to this situation because the adipose tissue is a very active metabolically organ. So this means that if we have 10 or 20 kilos more of fat, our insulin resistance is much more in addition to the previous insulin resistance already present just because of the polycystic ovary syndrome. And this makes up an issue because there were increased androgen levels, reduced SHBG, altered menstrual cyclicity in women that being PCOS are also obese. What are the effects of the addition of MAIO and D-inositol? We had a few small experiments in this way, and it reports on the fact that if we intervene not only with MAIO-inositol, but also with the combination of MAIO and D-inositol, we arrive to reduce free testosterone levels much faster than it occurs with MAIO-inositol alone. So the effect at the end is the same, but we obtain a much faster effect using the combination of the two. Since in many parts of the world, and the audience tonight would confirm this, I suppose there is an important use of another insulin sensitizers, which was the first one, which is metformin. I performed a meta-analysis of the only 6 studies that are until now published and comparing the two, so metformin and inositols. And you could see here, this is just an abstract of all the meta-analysis. All these lines represent a different outcome. And so HOMA index, testosterone, androstenedione, SHBG, and BMI changes under metformin are absolutely superimposable to what's happened to those during neo-inositol treatment. So the effect of metformin and MAIO-inositol on this kind of outcomes are absolutely similar. They had equal efficacy. The difference between the two is that if we compare metformin and myo-inositol on side effects, the tolerability is of paramount importance, is much different, because there is a 5.17 relative risk ratio to as a gastrointestinal or other side effect using metformin rather than using myo-inositol. And this is in the experience of everybody, every one of us that uses these two compounds, that we had many women that put once in metformin treatment, they abandoned this treatment. They skipped out because of these side effects. And this is certainly an atu of inositol for our purposes. In fact, just to answer the question that was about toxicity, here there is just a few of the studies that are reported in literature where 4 grams a day, 6, 12, until 30 grams a day of inositol in a situation of obsessive compulsive disorder have been used in humans without almost negligible side effects, apart from small nausea, flatus, and diarrhea. But all these main side effects arrived and have been described only with doses highest than 12 grams a day. This is just to read the first words in red. Myo-inositol enhances the FSH signal, and this could have an important impact on the ovulation, as you can see later in the next slide. We know for more than 20 years ago that insulin levels are a problem where we try to induce ovulation. At that time, we have had the experience of the first controlled superovulation, ovarian superovulation, and in the group of Frank in London demonstrate this good correlation. The highest are the fasting insulin levels, the more we need in terms of vials of FSH to induce ovulation. So insulin levels counteract the ovarian responses to FSH. And based on this observation, many people in the world try to perform different trials, and you could have here a meta-analysis of those trials. These trials reported more or less the pre-treatment for 3 months and the months of controlled ovarian induction before the IVF or ICSI. There were 6 randomized controlled trials reported in this respect, and the results are this one. The first is that we need less vials of recombinant FSH to obtain ovulation. In particular, according to the meta-analysis, we need less 3 vials of FSH. But this is not really important. This is just a demonstration that the experiment performed in London 20 years ago have a good impact on our day-to-day activity. The most important efficacy of the pre-treatment with inositol in assisted reproduction is that we obtain a 45% increase in the risk of a clinical pregnancy rate, which means an important addition and an important help to our performance in terms of reproduction. The importance and the impact that the two Mayo and Dichiro and their ratio has on ovulation is reported in this recently published paper, where the authors, you see, experimented different ratio from Mayo to Dichiro, starting on the left from only the inositol to the left part or almost only neo, just 80 neo and one part of the Kiro. And you could see here that this is the progesterone levels measured at the first, at the second, and at the third cycle of observation. You see that only with 40 to 1 and 80 to 1, we have an important secretion of progesterones indicating ovulation being in that women. On the other hand, the insulin resistance through HOMA index improved with every one of this treatment. And this makes the difference between the metabolic effect, which is obtained with both MAIO and the inositol, and the reproductive effect, which is obtained only with the combination where myo-inositol is at least 40 or 80 to 1 present respect to the Kiro. I go on, and these are the take-home points that I would leave tonight. Insulin resistance, we understand, is the main driver of PCO syndrome, and thus insulin sensitizers represent an etiological-based intervention. This is an important piece of work. Similarly to metformin, we have seen clinical trials established the efficacy of inositols in improving endocrine and metabolic disorders of PCOS patients. Inositols, however, are much better tolerated than metformin. And finally, an excess, the inositol, seems to characterize the ovary of PCOS women. Therefore, MAIO and the inositol in an appropriate ratio like 40 to 1 improve ovulation, and such combination increase the performances of assisted reproduction.
Thank you, doctors. Thank you very much for the patient listening. After this, we will have a Q&A session with Dr. Datta. Dr. Datta, there are a lot of comments from the doctors that your presentation was very good, especially from Dr. Archana Kumari, Dr. Pradeep Acharya, and Dr. Subhadra Malik. So there are multiple comments.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Yes. So we will have a Q&A session now, and as doctors keep on putting their questions, posting their questions in the chat box, I will read out those questions to you.
Sure.
The first questions you have already answered about the glucose tolerance test.
I'll just repeat the glucose tolerance test because I think this is something which is very important.
Yes, ma'am.
And anytime a woman comes to you, she may not be fasting. It could be after meal. It could be fasting. Any time of the day she comes to you, she has to take 75 grams of glucose. It can be a pre-prepared packet. Nowadays, we get companies which have come out with 75 grams glucose pre-prepared already in the pouch. All she has to do is pour it in the glass and drink it up. Otherwise, if that is not available, then she has to take 75 grams glucose and dissolve it in 300 ml of water and drink that amount. 2 hours after that, she drinks that glucose, she has to go in for a blood sugar test, and that value has to be less. If it is normal, it is less than 140. If it is more than 140, then definitely we start telling her to go in for a nutritional therapy. A value more than 200, you label her as frankly diabetic and start her on hypoglycemic therapy. Then next is that suppose she vomits that preparation that she's taken. If she vomits within half an hour, then tell her to repeat it the next day, because then she's just vomited and you tell her that you take it again is quite irritating for that woman also. So she can come the next day, she can take an antiemetic before and she can swallow that preparation again and she can repeat that blood sugar. But if she vomits after half an hour or after an hour, then that glucose has already got absorbed. So you can repeat the test after 2 hours. a value over 140 is definitely considered to be hyperglycemia in pregnancy. Next question, Prat.
Right, ma'am. Thank you. Next question is regarding the glucose tolerance test only. For this test, is it necessary that women should come in fasting?
No, no. For the DIPSI guidelines, what Foxy has given, the woman does not have to be fasting before doing a GCT.
Right, ma'am. The next question is, of course, about the inositol, the treatment, the dosage. It is myoinositol and decaro-inositol. The combination is 40:1. We recommend twice a day and at least 3 months of treatment, 3 to 6 months of treatment. That is what we recommend in PCOS.
Yeah, 4 grams a day. Now, normally you've come out with a 2-gram sachet, so it is twice a day.
Yes.
40:1 ratio, and they say you have to continue it for at least 12 weeks before the results start coming out, and then keep taking it.
Right, ma'am. Yes. Thank you, ma'am. The next question is from Dr. Banala. The question is regarding dose of metformin in GDM.
Okay, what I start off with is 500 milligrams twice daily, and then I keep monitoring the postprandial blood sugar. After meals. So after a full meal, I tell her to get 2 hours after a full meal. I tell her to get a PP blood sugar done. Any value more than 120, and I hike up the dose.
Right.
With along with this, definitely dietary therapy as well as lifestyle modification has to be done. You can grow up to 2 grams per day. 2 grams per day, it's not a problem at all. Metformin does the best thing about metformin, which I love, is that it does not cause hypoglycemia. So if it is not causing hypoglycemia, all I have to take care of is the hyperglycemic aspect. It is not going to cause any hypoglycemia in the fetus either.
Right, ma'am. Thank you. Ma'am, there was this question yesterday that if a woman is on PCOS and she conceives and first trimester also she continues metformin, so should she continue this metformin in second trimester as well? So that was the question, ma'am.
See, various studies are being done, various theories are being put forward. Initially, when we started using metformin, the people would say that stop metformin as soon as pregnancy is confirmed, because metformin crosses the placental barrier and can cause congenital anomalies in the neonate. Now it has been shown that metformin does not increase any incidence of congenital anomalies. So, second advantage of continuing metformin in the first trimester is that it decreases the incidence of miscarriages in the first trimester, because we all know that PCOS have a hyperandrogenic status. Then and with the pregnancy occurring in PCOS, they have a high chances of abortions. Metformin decreases that incidence to a significant aspect. In fact, I read somewhere that if without metformin, the incidence is 41%. If you continue metformin in the first trimester, that incidence comes down to 8.1% only of miscarriages. So undoubtedly, metformin should be continued in the first trimester. Beyond that, what they are saying beyond that, the present guidelines are saying you can stop metformin beyond that. There's no need to continue metformin in the second trimester. But remember, she has to be again screened for GDM. And if she is found out to be that her sugar is rising, she is going on to the hyperglycemia state, you need to resume or restart metformin. Some people continue metformin throughout pregnancy because they feel that this prevents GDM and prevents any complications which can occur to the baby because of any undetected hyperglycemia. As a lot of women, as unfortunately sometimes women get lost to follow up, and the awareness amongst our antenatals about the continuous monitoring of a PCO in pregnancy may sometimes be deficient in a certain places. But according to the present guidelines, they say metformin need not be continued beyond the first trimester.
Right, ma'am. Thank you very much. The question is whether we can continue the myoinositol and D-inositol in pregnancy. Yes, this can be continued. We do have a data. So that question I have already covered. We do have a data of myoinositol in GDM as well. So it is indicated in GDM as well. The next question is, do we continue with inositol when they conceive?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, we should continue with ionositol when they conceive. Normally, I mean, you should realize, as the protocol says, if they conceive with something, continue with that thing, because that is something which has created a favorable environment in her body, which has allowed that pregnancy to occur. So if she conceives with ionositol, she should continue ionositol in the same dose in which she was taking, so that complications are less in this pregnancy.
Right, ma'am. Thank you very much. We will be waiting some more for the additional questions. I will take a few seconds. How long one should continue this inositol? That's the next question. So as I said, 3 to 6 months, that is what the data we have. So up to 6 months of data we definitely have, but it can be continued till the end of pregnancy. Ma'am, any other point you wanted to cover or especially discuss as far as PCOS and GDM, especially with the doctors?
I think we all know, sitting here, we all know, all the participants here, everybody here knows that PCOS and GDM are interlinked. That
Yes.
is point one. Point two, we all know that type 2 diabetes mellitus is a pandemic in the occurring, and we know, and GDM is the best screening tool for type 2 diabetes mellitus. So we should pick up each and every woman with GDM. No woman with GDM, I mean, no GDM should get missed in our country. If we can pick up GDMs, and if we can manage GDMs, and if we can make them aware that they have a high incidence of becoming type 2 diabetes, and that their children also have a chance of becoming type 2 diabetes and ending up with something called a metabolic syndrome, I think that is a battle half won. So since we have a nexus between PCO, and here I again come back to the first thing, that since there is a nexus between PCO and GDM, so any woman with PCO who is getting pregnant, or in fact, any woman with PCO should be told right at the outset that she needs to have a lifestyle modification, especially if she's obese, and that she has a chance of becoming GDM later, as well as type 2 diabetes later. So if we can manage PCOS and in turn manage GDM, I think we won the battle against diabetes. That is where I think the whole thing about why we are, at least Foxy is so focused on PCO, like calling it a PCO week, PCO month, and Foxy is so focused on GDM nowadays, because this we want to target. We are not just interested in just the GDM now. We are trying to give a healthy India tomorrow. That is our focus.
Correct, ma'am. Absolutely correct. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I mean, very beautifully you have summarized the GDM and the PCOS GDM nexus and how to tackle. And I don't see any more questions in the chat box. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Prachi.
Yes.
Thanks a lot, Sheel, for giving me this opportunity to share my thoughts with the audience. And I hope we can keep taking these steps forward to have a healthy India.
Yes.
Jai Hind.
Thank you.
Thank you,
ma'am. Thank you, doctor, for your wonderful presentation, ma'am. And we'll connect, madam, again. Sure. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Saurabh. Thank you.
Bye-bye and good evening.
Bye, everybody. Thank you, everybody, for giving me a patient listening.